Hi, everyone. Welcome to this podcast. Kat Toups MD is a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, board certified by the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology, and previously boarded in geriatric psychiatry. She is also a certified practitioner with the Institute for Functional Medicine, and I'm really excited to have you on today, Kat. I'm glad we were able to work through our technical difficulties that we experienced twice now trying to record this podcast. So I was thinking, it's not meant to be, but it was, and I'm so glad you're here. So thank you for being here.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited. Your specialty is dementia and sharing with the world that there are things we can do that can affect this, which I think is really amazing because one of my biggest motivators in terms of staying healthy and making the choices that I make is brain health, because I tell everybody, all my clients, my friends, I don't want to die the last half of my life. I want to live fully functioning, fully aware of those around me and who they are until the day that I die, and then just, pass away in my sleep, cross my fingers, And so brain health is really important to me because there are so many people that as they age, the last 20, 30 years of their life, there's that mental decline. And to me, that's one of the scariest things I think that can happen to you. But you've personally experienced this and come through it the other side. So I'm just so excited to talk to you. So can you share what's your story? How did this happen for you?
Yeah. It is quite a story. In retrospect, at the time, it was just trying to get through. So, excuse me, when I turned 50, I started to realize that I had dementia. I was doing Alzheimer's clinical trials. I ran a clinical trials research center, and I had done 20 long-term Alzheimer trials. So I've worked with, many, many patients with Alzheimer's, and I was testing my patients, and I was giving them 3 words to remember on a mini mental status exam. And I was having to write the words down so that I could ask my patients the words with a recall. And I had used those words for 20 years. I had 2 sets of words that I alternated, and I would have to write them down to remember which ones I asked them. So that was my big eye opener that, oh my God, I'm getting to be as cognitively impaired as my patients. And what had happened, well, actually, I had developed multiple chemical sensitivities. So I was just covered with rashes, covered with hives. I was sensitive to everything. I couldn't get out of a chair for a year. If I walked into a store, the smells would just, give me more rashes and more hives and more fatigue and more brain fog. So I had all this inflammation in my body that was literally eating up my brain. And I closed down my practice. I moved my trials to another research center. And I thought it was going to take a month or 2 off of work and be back to work. And it was a three-year path. It got to the point that I couldn't do things on the computer. I couldn't remember how to do things. And I would ask my husband, and he'd get mad at me because he'd say, I just showed you how to do that. And I couldn't remember how to do things I knew how to do before. I couldn't drive a car safely. My husband got in the car with me and said, Kat, what's wrong with you? You're like a little old lady. And I said, I don't know. There's so many things that are coming at you when you're driving. And basically my processing speed was so diminished that I couldn't integrate all the things happening with driving. And I literally lost the ability to back up or parallel park my car. I could not do those. I couldn't sequence those events. I would try and forget it. And I'd go find another parking space. I developed auditory processing problems. So I couldn't understand what was being said. And I thought it was a hearing loss. I kept going to my ENT and saying, give me some hearing aids. And they'd say, well, you just have a mild hearing loss. You don't need hearing aids. And finally it got so bad, I went in and I said, just give me the hearing aids. I have to try them. And the doctor looked at me funny and he said, this isn't in your ear, it's in your brain. And they did testing, and I had developed auditory processing problems, which meant that I couldn't decode the sounds when there was any background noise or muffled or distortion. So just all kinds of crazy stuff were going on. And basically I had developed dementia. So it was, quite a quite a shock, given that I had been a dementia researcher for so long. And, I was 50 years old then. And when I work with patients who develop dementia in their 50s, it goes very quickly. So late onset Alzheimer's, which is after 65, typically there's a 10-year progression until, presumably death. But when people get Alzheimer's in their earlier years, or dementia, there's a bunch of different kinds of dementia. They're not all Alzheimer's. It's a different critter. And so that is sort of what happened to me. And that's how I came to learn functional medicine, because I knew the limitations of traditional medicine. I knew that all of the medications we have on the market for Alzheimer's don't work. I've done all the clinical trials with all the medications that are out there. And, at best they slow things down, reportedly up to a year, but they do nothing to cure the root causes. So they don't offer any benefit. So I went to a conference called Food is Medicine. I don't know if you've been to that one. It's an amazing, amazing conference. And that opened my eyes and just basically changed my life, understanding. I thought I ate healthy, but, understanding the power of food to determine our health, our brain, our immune system, it was quite an eye-opener. And so from there, I started the path of learning functional medicine and gradually work through all the different factors to get my brain back online.
Wow. So many questions came up while you were talking, but you actually ended up sort of answering a couple of them. Because I was going to ask, is Alzheimer's and dementia, are those interchangeable words?
Yeah, they're kind of used interchangeably, but dementia is any kind of problems with your cognitive functioning, and there's many, many kinds of dementia. And now what's important for our purposes is there's many reasons that dementia happens. So whether it's Alzheimer's, whether it's frontotemporal dementia, whether it's early onset, Alzheimer's or dementia, there's many, many kinds. And really for our purposes, just like with traditional medicine, we're taught to name a disease and give a drug for it. And what we're finding is that doesn't cure people, right? It manages their disease, but it doesn't get them well. Well, same thing in Alzheimer's. There are different types of Alzheimer's, different types of dementias that might give us some information about the course or what we can expect. But still, the bottom line is less what is the name of the type of dementia, but why do you have it, and what are all those factors? Because then if we can find all of those factors and fix them, then we can stop the dementia, or even reverse the dementia if it's not too late.
So you were a researcher in this field. Mm-hmm. And so by the time you realized that you were struggling with this disease, you also knew that everything, your life's work basically told you that there was no cure for this, that there was nothing that you could do in the medical community. You tried all of those, you experimented with those. So what was it that really prompted you to look beyond that? Where was the, if that was your life's work, so I'm sure you were very sincere about it, very intentional about trying to find a cure, right? And that was a passion of yours. So what, when it came to you, prompted you to end up looking outside the medical community and into more, or conventional medicine, and into more functional medicine? Like, was there a book you read, or was it that you just heard about that conference, or a friend, or what was that prompting for you?
Well, I've always been interested in integrative medicine and, looked at whatever it takes to heal people. I'm a psychiatrist by training, and, that's a whole nother conversation with, general psychiatry and psychiatric meds and the limitations of that. And so I've always looked out of the box for what can I do to help people. So looking out of the box, I guess, wasn't new for me. And I was taking a course with Julia Ross, learning about neuronutrients for psychiatric disorders. And it was kind of a year-long thing. And somehow, I don't know if it was there, but I know a woman, a colleague in my class there, had been to the Food is Medicine conference. And so, I don't know, somehow I just got this intuitive hit, like, okay, that sounds fascinating. I'm going to go to that conference. And that definitely clearly put me on the path. Mark Hyman was teaching there, Patrick Hanaway was teaching there, all of, the main, Liz Lipsky, some of the people that all teach at the Institute for Functional Medicine. And they kept mentioning Institute for Functional Medicine. So I'm sitting there in the audience Googling, okay, what's IFM? And their first module, the next one coming up was autoimmune and allergy. And of course, I was being racked by immune problems and allergies. And I said, oh my God, I have to go to that conference. So I went to that conference. I had a sieve for a brain. I mean, I couldn't remember anything, retain anything. Luckily I'm a good note taker, but it actually, because as an outgrowth of that, I needed a study team, to help me learn. And so I put together a group in the San Francisco Bay Area of some of the best people, learning and practicing functional medicine. And I'd say we've been together 7 years now, maybe, that we've met monthly, this study group. And out of that, I've organized different groups. I have a functional medicine listserv. It takes a village to learn all this stuff. As you know, you're trying to help people understand and educate them as well. And we have to come at all kinds of diseases, be it dementia, immune, whatever, from all different angles. So it really helps to put our heads together and learn. And so that's kind of how I got started on the learning path. And then I didn't intend to become a functional medicine doctor per se. I was just trying to survive. But the next module was GI. Well, by then I needed the GI module, and the next module was detox. And so, as I did each module, I worked through all the layers on myself, of course, and then, learned to translate that for my patients as well. But we're certainly our best teachers.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Your story reminds me so much of Dr. Terry Walls, because you started out sort of in the conventional field, and then your personal struggles really drove you to research and find other answers. And then you basically hacked your bodies, figured it out, and got well. So one of the things that I was wondering as you were talking, that's an interesting and difficult transition for a lot of people to make from the conventional side to the functional side. Did you
Right.
have a lot of resistance from colleagues that you had before this, or were your friends supportive? Was there any kickback when you started talking about functional medicine and how it can help Alzheimer's and dementia?
Yeah, yes and no. I think for me and my community, I was, already an activist, well known in a lot of levels. I had been really active I'd been the president of the local psych association and on the board, and I was on the board of the Northern California Psych. And so I had a lot of credibility, I guess, that helped as I transitioned to this field. And then because I am in the San Francisco Bay Area, we have a lot of wonderful, integrative and functional practitioners. So it was really, for me, it was not hard to make a community of support for that. Now, within the dementia world, that's a different story. And interestingly, we have a group called UCSF Women's Mental Health Listserv, and it's a listserv of traditional mental health practitioners. And I would start saying some things with some of the questions that people would ask about ideas with functional medicine. And at one point, one of the people in charge, one of the academics, said, "Oh no, you can't talk about this. This is an evidence-based listserv." And everything that I know, I've learned from an evidence base, right? There is, data and research to back up, the majority of what we do in functional medicine. And I've, of course, learned that many things that I learned in medical school as dogma, there is no research to verify that. It's just a myth that's been perpetuated and not always correctly. So in that listserv, they would talk about pregnant women and give them this medication and that medication, and stuff that I didn't think there was evidence-based for the safety of, right? But what would happen was, when I'd write about functional medicine, some of the other practitioners would email me and say, "Thank you for what you said. That was really helpful." And then what happened is some of those practitioners started coming to see me as patients.
Oh, wow.
I was back to practicing. And so fast forward to now, people will write on that listserv and say, I need a functional practitioner for this case, or I need a functional practitioner for that case. So it's making its way into the mainstream. It's a very exciting shift, and I think it's happening correctly. I always call it the real medicine. To me, functional medicine is the real medicine that most of us went to medical school hoping to help people get better, right? But we didn't get the right tools for all the ways to get people better.
Right before we got on, I was on Instagram, and I thought it was so apropos because Dr. David Perlmutter on his stories posted this here, and I don't know if you can say that. It says, Alzheimer's disease, yes, Alzheimer's can be reversed. A treatment for Alzheimer's is closer than we think. So he's promoting that as well. I know he's another big name, and so it is really exciting. So I know a lot of people that are listening right now are thinking, okay, you've primed us. We know that there's hope. So let's talk about the nitty gritty. What are some root causes of dementia? And then how can we make positive effects for change?
Yeah. Well, no, and I think that's a really important thing. First off is the hope that dementia is not a death sentence. I mean, I'm working on a book about dementia, how to operationalize it. What can practitioners do? What do patients need to know to bring to their doctors? And I think one of the chapters is called Dementia is Not a Death Sentence. So when my patients go to the academic medical centers and get worked up for dementia, that's what they come away with. Get your affairs in order. You have this disease. There's no cure. And I have more than one patient that has PTSD from that experience of being told that, how they were told. And, and when we think there's no hope, there is no hope, right? First, we have to empower people to believe that there's hope. And I think in, many ways now, 9 years fast forward from when I got really sick and demented, I realized, okay, I had to go through that path so that, I could at least bring hope to people that you can come out the other side. So dementia happens for many reasons, and it's pretty much almost never one reason. It's the perfect storm. It's multiple things that come together. And, the things that are happening by the time someone has cognitive impairment started many years before that. Now, many people are writing books and talking about Alzheimer's, and they talk about the importance of the diet, changing your diet. They talk about exercise. They talk about sleep. They talk about stress reduction. So they talk about brain training. And so I'll just say that all of those things are where you have to start. It's where you start with dementia. It's where you start with any chronic illness. It's where you start with health, right? You have to, you very well know as a nutrition specialist, what we're eating, the health of our gut, the immune system is primarily in our gut, and that's determining the health of our body and our brain. Our brain is connected to everything. So I don't want to say too much about those things, though we can maybe talk a little bit about some of the dietary specifics, like with ketogenic diets and stuff that we're doing with dementia. But really the message that I think people are missing, and that I want to just say up front, is some of the big drivers of dementia are infections, toxins, and lack of hormones. And I think those are not getting quite enough airplay. So I follow, you're probably aware, and if anybody listening that's interested in dementia, Dale Bredesen has been, an amazing mover and shaker, bringing the message to the world about a functional medicine approach of how to reverse dementia. He has a wonderful book called The End of Alzheimer's. And he instituted a program that is run through IFM, where they train practitioners in a functional method. So I've been working with Dale for several years now, and we've been working on designing a prospective clinical trial that will hopefully be starting very soon. So there's a group on Facebook that's called Bredesen Unaffiliated Protocol or something like that, and it's patients and some physicians and some other professionals, but they're mostly patients that are following the protocol, and they're getting support from each other. And so I'm reading to understand what do people struggle with? How can I support them better? How can I support my patients? And people will say, okay, I've been doing Dr. Bredesen's protocol. I'm following all the diet. I'm in ketosis. I'm doing the brain training. I'm exercising. I'm taking, $1,000 worth of supplements every month. and it's been 9 months and I'm not better. And so the message is, you've got to start with those things, but really you need to partner with a physician to try to figure out what else beyond all of your nutrient deficiencies. It's been known for, many, many decades, B12 deficiency can cause Alzheimer's, vitamin D deficiency can cause Alzheimer's. I mean, vitamin D is such an important factor. If your vitamin D is less than 30, you have a 75% increased risk of dementia. And if it's less than 20, it's like 125% increased risk. So, that's something easily we can check our children, right? I mean, where I live in San Francisco area, we're too far north to make enough vitamin D, even for people that are outside all the time. So, that's kind of an easy thing to do. But people are doing, all of these kind of basic things, and they still don't. If you don't stop what has caused your dementia, then it's going to keep going. So you'll feel better if you do all those things. So let's talk about infections. Lyme disease is a huge factor. And, I have a small practice. I'm a solo practitioner. And I think I have 4 of my dementia patients that have active IgM positive Lyme disease. And, Lyme is related to syphilis. They're both spirochetes. And, we know from the previous century that, people would get syphilis, which is a sexually transmitted disease, and they would seemingly get over it. And then, 10, 20, 30 years down the road, they'd go crazy. And this because the spirochete likes to live in the brain and wreak havoc in the brain. Well, Lyme does the same thing. So some people may have had Lyme for 20, 30 years, and it's maybe just, causing havoc now. So, I mean, but I see it in young people. I see young people that have Lyme, and, they can't think, their brains don't work, they can't remember things. So infections are a huge thing, and it's not just Lyme. So what's emerging recently is a larger body of evidence of the effect of some of the viruses and the links with Alzheimer's. I'd say we've known for about 15 years, maybe 12 or 15 years, about herpes simplex 1, that there's a high correlation with Alzheimer's. And it doesn't mean that it caused it per se, but they autopsied brains of people that had died with Alzheimer's, and it was something like 98 or 99% of them had herpes simplex 1 in their brains.
Whoa.
Whereas general population, I want to say it's like, I don't know precisely, but it's less than 80%, some higher than 70, and more than 80% of people have had herpes simplex 1, which is cold sores, right? We all, get that as kids, or most of us do, at least 3/4 of us do. But what happens with the viruses? And so also in this past year, some really great data came out saying HHV6 and HHV7, which are other types of herpes viruses. So HH stands for human herpes. So it's human herpes virus 6, human herpes virus 7, had a very high correlation with Alzheimer's. And so with these viruses, we get viruses and our immune system takes care of it. We feel better. But many times the viruses are still living within us, and then something can happen to reactivate those viruses, right, and cause problems for us. And another really fascinating study came out this year about people that had herpes and took acyclovir for it in midlife. So acyclovir is an antiviral drug. And sometimes people take it that either have oral herpes or genital herpes. And if you have a flare-up, it'll shorten the duration of your flare-up. And some people that have frequent flare-ups will just take it chronically to suppress that virus. Well, studies showed that if people had a single course of treatment with acyclovir in midlife, they had a much lower incidence of Alzheimer's in later life.
Really?
Yes, really. And so, now it's a big, talk in some of my study groups. I'm in a study group with Dale Bredesen and a couple other colleagues. And, we're all saying, well, wow, if we have patients that have high level of antibodies to herpes, should we, even though they're not symptomatic, should we just go ahead and treat them for a while with acyclovir and see if we can knock down that viral load? I mean, there's no data on that. We don't really know, but so the issues with viruses and with Lyme disease in the brain are huge and definitely need to be investigated. The other thing is mold. So mold and mycotoxins. Then,
Well, that's so huge. And I think nobody talks about that. I mean, you're mentioning things that nobody talks about.
That's why I wanted to jump right into these things, right?
Yeah.
Because they're doing a good job, I think, on the diet and the exercise and the brain training. And I mean, and I'll just say exercise, that's our best validated thing to change our brain. We know it increases BDNF, your brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and that helps you make new neuronal connections. And you talked about wanting to, go into when you get into that last, third or quarter of your life.
I want to be climbing mountains when I'm like 80,
I have patients that do. And that is a huge and easy and cheap, accessible to everyone kind of thing. But yes, beyond that, looking at these infections and then the mold and the mycotoxins, mold just eats up people's brains. And, some people are more sensitive to mold than others. If you follow the Richie Shoemaker stuff, he was, said, okay, there's certain genetic haplotypes that make you more sensitive. We're finding out more with people that are working now more clinically with mold. It doesn't even seem to matter that much. I mean, if you have just the right loading, the right type of mold, it can make anybody sick. Some people.
My dad's working through that right now. He was starting to sort of, he's like 65-ish, and all of a sudden looked like he felt like he was in his 80s. I mean, and it was just like he slowed down tremendously, was a little shaky. He was losing his voice, and it's funny which parts of things start bothering people. Right. Losing his voice is what really started to bother him. And so they ended up remediating the mold. It was actually in his office building. Completely remediated it. We're working on some gut things. His voice is coming back, but it's just like, he's worked there for 20, 30 years. So chronic exposure. Right. And what you just said is what's so scary about it is it eats your brain.
And, the speech, I want to echo on that, because that is one of the things that sometimes helps me to think about mold, because I have seen it affect the voice and the speech like that. So there's a type of dementia called frontotemporal dementia, and Alzheimer's starts primarily in the hippocampus, in the center of our brain, which is our memory center. But frontotemporal dementia is eating up your frontal lobes and your temporal lobes. And there's different variants within frontotemporal. There's a behavioral variant, but there's a variant that is called progressive logopenic aphasia, and it's a problem with speech. Well, I have seen those speech problems in several people with mold, and I have a very close friend who got quite demented and sick from mold, and it was in her home. And she got to the point that she couldn't speak. She would talk like this, and she could not articulate her words. And I could tell that she had the thought in her head, but she had an expressive aphasia, and she could not say what she wanted to say. It was so incredibly painful to try to, be with her, help her, get those words out, and I kept begging her to, get out of her house. I found out that she'd had a positive mold report when she bought the house and didn't think it. She remediated some of it, but not all of it. And I would tell her that when I went to her house, I would get a headache every time I went there. So for me, that's a tip off with mold. It gives me instant headaches. So finally she agreed. I mean, all her markers, there's tests that we can do that indicate different types of neuropeptides and hormones and neuroinflammation. And it's not any one thing that tells us mold, but it's kind of a pattern recognition. And then there's we can look at visual contrast sensitivity testing, and, there's urine mycotoxin testing that, I'm not sure, yet. The jury's out for me on, the utility of that, but there's, many things. And of course, then people can easily do home mold testing. And we should mention that if people are suspicious, I use a company called Mycometrics, spelled metrics in the traditional way, Mycometrics, and it's mycometrics.com. And the mold inspectors use that company as well. And so you can order, they have two different tests, an ERMI and a HERTSMI. The ERMI is the bigger test, and it's probably more useful to do that one. It's $290, and you can order a Swiffer dust cloth or a vacuum canister. So I tell people, order the Swiffer dust cloth. I learned this from a mold inspector I worked with, and he says, fold your cloth into quarters, and then you're going to collect dust from your house, and you want to collect all the dust in that one quarter. Because what's going to happen is when you send it in, they vacuum off the dust, and then they're going to PCR test it for genetics, and they're going to look at all the species of mold that are in there. So what you want to do is collect dust from everywhere in your house, except where you see mold. So if you actually see any mold, you do not want to collect that, because that particular mold will overgrow everything. And so what you want to do is get a sample of all the kinds of mold in your home. And sometimes people have mold problems and there's no visible mold. So you can't just say, oh, I'm fine, I don't see any mold in my home. And then once you get the results from that test, you can go to a website, a free website called myhousemakesmesick.com. And then you can put in the scores into My House Makes Me Sick of some of the subsets of that ERMI test. And they will give you a HERTSMI score, and they will tell you, okay, this is safe, this is very unsafe, or okay, this is in between and it needs, more investigation. So that is something that people can definitely do to know. And sometimes it's in the car. I've had some patients where the mold exposure was in their car, that they'd had a leak or something got wet. So the mold is another huge factor, and so that needs to be investigated and looked at. So those are the molds and the infections. The toxins are another thing. Our world is getting so toxic, as we all know. And, we see the incidence of so many disorders, immune disorders are, sky high. I mean, I barely heard of Hashimoto's when I went to medical school, over 30 years ago. And now I'd say, at least a quarter of my patients have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, right? An autoimmune thyroid. So things are triggering, more and more immune problems. We're having more and more, autism. When I went to my psychiatry training in child psychiatry module, autism was so rare back then. This was in the later 80s, so rare. And now Asperger's and autism are through the roof. So one of the things that's driving all of that and driving our dementias and our brain diseases is toxins. And so the toxins have to be looked at, the heavy metals and the chemical toxins. And with the heavy metals, lead in particular, both lead and mercury like to accumulate in the brain. And so, if you find that you have high levels of those things, detoxifying those metals, especially the lead, can actually make a huge difference in people's cognition.
Do you find that comes a lot from, childhood, from people that are within a certain age range, like maybe baby boomers and things like that, where the paint and toys and things that they used to play with had lead in it more so than maybe the younger generations?
So that's a super great question, and yes and no. So yes, of course, people, people will have things from earlier in life, and the older you get, the more you've been exposed, and you will, accrue more and more toxins. But I also see sometimes high level of toxins in young people. And I don't treat children, but and my colleagues who do treat children who are working up kids for autism, they sometimes see high level of metals or toxins in there. And where do they get it? Well, they get it sometimes from the mother. So,
sure.
I think when I first learned functional, we were trained that babies are born with more than 200 chemicals in their body. And now I read a new statistic, and it's closer to 300 chemicals in their body. So that's just from what the mother is exposed to, what the mother puts on her skin and her hair. I try to teach all my patients from the get-go, you have to change everything in your life. If you want to be healthy, you've got to go and, over time, it's hard to throw out everything you own with your hair and cleaning products, but it needs to be done, because those are all, they're all contributing to the toxic load. So I do with the chemicals, a test came out just a couple years ago that Great Plains Labs does, and it's called the TOX test, TOX test. And that's an easy test to do. It's just a first morning urine collection. It's $219. So, in the scheme of things, it's, not a break the bank test, but it's so important. I had a patient that I was treating for dementia, and she had some cardiovascular risk factors, and she didn't have hormones for 20 years. So she had some risk factors, but her dementia still was farther along. It was more intense than I expected based on what I was seeing. And then the tox test came available, and I tested her. And this woman, okay, if you have one test in the red zone, it's considered significant. She had 7 or 9 tests in the red zone. I mean, like everything was in the red zone. And I've never seen one nearly as bad, since then. Well, okay, so then you think, okay, how did she get exposed to these chemicals, right? What did she do? What was her occupation? That's something that I always ask in the beginning, people's occupations, to understand some of the things they might be exposed to. Well, chemicals like hairdressers, people who do hair color, they're getting exposed to a lot of chemicals, right? People that work in the oil field or the chemistry field, but this lady was a school teacher. She was a school teacher, and her daughter said, my parents were always into health. We never used a lot of chemicals. We always ate, clean, simple food. And so why did she have all these chemicals? Well, she didn't detoxify well. So sometimes it's just a genetic thing, right? Some of us have genes that say, oh, we don't detoxify well. We have SNPs or mutations. And so if your genetics are not good for detoxification, you're going to accrue more things. So you might be a child with poor detox genes. And so, and you may have the next door neighbor kid that has the same lifestyle that is fine. And if your genes don't detoxify well, you may be in trouble. And one of those obvious genes that a lot of us test for is the MTHFR gene, or the methylfolate mutation, and that is very important with detoxification. So people who have 2 copies of that mutation, it's very easy to help support that and help them methylate well by giving the right doses of B vitamins and methylfolate. But if you have that mutation, and I have 2 copies of it, and I turn out high on everything, and of course I got dementia from multiple sources. So it's not just age, I guess, is the long answer of getting here. That it can be a factor for everybody.
Wow. Okay. So you talked about infections, so viruses and mold and things like that, toxins, certainly heavy metals, and chemical exposure. And you had also mentioned low hormones.
Right.
So would that affect men and women equally, or would that be more present in women?
Yes, no, it gets both men and women. And when we think about, the decline of hormones, so for women, we lose our hormones sooner than men, but men do lose their hormones with age as well.
Well, and especially if they have all that other stuff going on, if they're exposed to chemicals and toxins, that's totally gonna. That's
such an important point. So I can't tell you how many young men in their 20s and 30s that I have to treat with testosterone now, because of those factors, because anything going on in your brain, so we have the HPA axis in our brain, but the hypothalamus to the pituitary, that then goes to the adrenals, and it goes to the gonads, so the sex organs. So the brain is controlling all of our hormones to everything, and anything that disrupts the brain, what a great point, is going to disrupt that HPA axis. So if I have people in their 20s with Lyme disease or mold disease, they may not have high chemical load yet, though some of them do. But yes, all of those things affect the hormones. And then there's just general aging. So for women in menopause, perimenopause is a 10-year process, usually starts in the 40s and, ends, sometime in the early to mid 50s. Occasionally I see it go longer for people, but it's a 10-year process. And then men have andropause. So they do lose their hormones, but it's usually a little later in life than women do. Though again, we're seeing an explosion of men in their 50s and 60s that have no hormones. So one of the things I want to say about the hormones in the brain is we have receptors in our brain for all of these sex hormones. we don't just have those receptors in our sex organs, in our gonads, in our ovary, uterus, testicles. They're in our brain. So we have receptors for estrogen, for testosterone, for progesterone, for pregnenolone. All of those are in our brain. And so if we don't have enough of those hormones, they're literally trophic for the brain. They give life for the brain. Our neurons need them to function. And there was a wonderful study. I started studying estrogen in the brain maybe 10 years ago, and looking at all the research because it was affecting me at that time in my life. And there was a study that came out of Stanford, and they looked at women who were on hormone replacement, and they said, well, let's see what happens when we stop it. And I think these were women that were at higher risk for Alzheimer's. And so they randomized them either to stay on the hormone or stop the hormone. And then they followed them for 2 years. And what they found at the end of 2 years is 100% of the women who stopped their hormones had neurodegeneration. They could see it on the head scan. They could see it on the neuropsych testing. And it didn't matter in that study whether they were on bioidentical hormones or synthetic hormones. Any kind of hormones, if they stopped them, the brain was degenerating. Now, obviously, we don't want people on synthetic hormones. And, the hormones, I have many people who say, well, I don't want to take hormones. It's not natural. Well, what isn't natural is for us to live, 25 years past menopause. In the last century, you didn't live that, not the in the 1800s, we didn't live much past menopause. So, I think it's a choice. Do you want to keep your brain into old age? And hormones are a very important way to do that. And, now working with a cognitive protocol and cognitive patients, we're starting hormones on people that have been off of them for 20 years. And sometimes we can see giving those hormones back can make a difference to people, sometimes very quickly. So I think that's a super important thing, and just keeping them all in balance. And the pregnenolone is the grandmother hormone. So in the hormone cascade, we have cholesterol, and then that turns into pregnenolone. And then pregnenolone makes all of the other hormones, estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, even ultimately the thyroid hormones. And pregnenolone can be replaced as a supplement. I have no idea why it's not treated as a hormone, but it is a hormone. And that all of those tests can be easily ordered through Quest or LabCorp. People can ask their doctors to, test all those hormone levels. And there's very nice data with pregnenolone and cognition. So, that's something that can be easily replaced for people, even as a supplement. The other hormones, obviously, you have to have a prescription to replace them. And I would put the thyroid hormones in that whole cascade. The thyroid is so important and, huge for the brain. We know that when the thyroid doesn't function well, you get depressed. And so it's definitely affecting the brain as well as the metabolism. So getting all of those hormones in balance, looking at every one of them, getting them all in balance is another way to help support the brain and help to reverse the dementia for people.
I love that you just said reverse it, because that's so exciting.
Okay, so I want to tell you, I have a patient who, and I told, after I wrote this, I go, oh, this sounds like another good title. I think one of my chapters in my book is called Alzheimer's in Remission. So, there's no term about Alzheimer's in remission, but I worked with this patient. He did everything right. He had lost his license because of his cognitive impairment and his dementia. And he's doing so well now that he reapplied to get the driver's license. And I had to fill out a form, and it said diagnosis. Well, his diagnosis was Alzheimer's, but it's no longer Alzheimer's. At best, he has a little bit of mild cognitive impairment, but it's, definitely not Alzheimer's any longer. It doesn't meet criteria for that in any way. So I put Alzheimer's in remission, and I started laughing with him. I'm like, what a great title, Alzheimer's in remission. The world needs to know this, right? Because he went from having frank, Alzheimer diagnosis to he passed the driving test, he's driving fine, functioning in his world again in a very different way than he was a couple of years ago.
That's so amazing. That's so exciting. So I know that sometimes the symptoms can show up decades before the diagnosable symptoms. So what are some things that people should be aware of now, like in their 20s, 30s, 40s, in order to stay on top of this? What things should they look out for?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think those come back to the easier basics, first off the diet, right? And we know that controlling your blood sugar is important. I mean, having, high blood sugar, diabetes is destructive for the blood vessels and the neurons. So that's a big driver for that, and then, having high lipids, if you're eating, really bad fats and, fried foods and a crappy diet, and you have high uncontrolled lipids, you're going to pay for that down the road. So you won't feel those things in your 20s or 30s, but they're going to be insidiously destroying things in your body. So, keeping your diet clean and honest, that's the first place to start. The sleep is really important. And, when you're young, you think, oh, I can go without sleep. And I know I used to be able to sleep 5 hours and go. And what we know now is that when we sleep, our brain detoxifies. And that was just learned in the last year and a half ago, something, a big surprise. So lymphatics in our system help to drain things and detoxify things. And the lymphatics in the brain are called the glymphatics. And then we've learned that while we sleep, the ventricles have the fluid in our brain, and they expand, and the fluid just starts churning around like a washing machine, and then it supposedly is capturing whatever toxins have come into the brain, and then sending it out down into our lymph system and helping to eliminate that. So sleep is the washing machine for the brain. And if you don't sleep enough hours, if you're chronically sleeping 6 hours a night, you're depriving your brain of detoxification. That's going to catch up with you. And, when you're 20 or 30, you don't think that, but that's another factor, is the sleep. And then we talked earlier about the exercise, and exercise helps you to make new neurons. And you want to constantly be creating new neurons. So when I went to medical school, we were taught you have all the neurons you're ever going to have by 18. And it's just downhill from there. Well, that was another thing that was wrong. Thank goodness, right? Thank goodness. And now we know you can make new neurons even up to the time of death and old age. They put old people that are very close to death in scanners and given them tasks to learn new things, and they can see new synaptic connections happening. So, just constantly stimulating your brain, learning new things, doing new things, instead of
driving a different route to work. Yeah.
So the brain stimulation is huge. We have a lot of our cognitive patients are doing Brain HQ, which is a program that gives you sort of games to stimulate your brain. And, that's something that people could do at any age. One of their games on there is called Double Decision. And there was a beautiful study that looked at all different kinds of brain training. And that one test, the Double Decision, came out quite well, that when people had training on it and did it for maybe it was a month or two, not anything profound, and then they looked at them like 10 years down the road, and the people that had trained on that Double Decision had much lower Alzheimer's. So constantly stimulating your brain and learning new things. Sometimes people are complaining that, okay, I have to do this or do that. I say, well, just think of it this way. It's forcing you to make new neurons, So I think all those things will help, when you're younger.
So for you, what were maybe the top things that you discovered were the underlying issues that you were able to address for your individual situation?
It's been everything. I feel like I learned all the functional
medicine. You checked off all the boxes?
On myself. So I had developed multiple chemical sensitivity, and I didn't even know that term back then. And, I covered my bases. I had a rheumatologist and an endocrinologist, and, I would go the traditional route, and the endocrinologist, was very, he took a great history, did a great exam, repeated tests that I already had. And I came back to him and he said, Well, you clearly have autoimmune disease. It's just not in the textbooks yet, and that's always a hard thing when all kinds of things are going wrong, but there's not a name for it, right? In medicine, people want a name. Um, but, kind of unraveling things, well, all of that change coincided with, the end of perimenopause for me. So there was hormonal issues. But there was immune issues, and I'd had immune problems off and on, probably ever since medical school. And
So
so
you just
understand.
named two big life stressors. So
Yeah.
you went through medical school, which is a huge stress,
Yes.
and you had issues with your immune system after that. And then
Yes.
you went through menopause and you started having chemical sensitivities and other, I mean, that's a good thing because people need to sort of, when they're looking at their own life, realize that mental, emotional, physical, it doesn't really matter. If it's a big stressor in your life, you might not even think you're stressed out. But
Right.
these big stressors often act as triggers for these things, for sure. So
Right.
that's really interesting in your
Right.
book.
No, and you should see how many physicians have immune disorder, because yes, medical school is a very traumatic experience. If you're a kind and caring person, you end up with PTSD because it's quite an abusive process. At least it was when I trained.
Yeah.
So, and then on top of that, I mean, we had to breathe formaldehyde for a year. So we're doing gross anatomy, and I was in this giant room with 50 cadavers, and we're in there dissecting. And I mean, we would burn our lab coats after that. Then you couldn't get the smell out, right? And so, we know that formaldehyde is a neurotoxin. So, I think now I think I hope they have better OSHA laws and they're regulating, the air quality in there, but there was nothing like that when I went to medical school.
Mm.
So, with all of the rashes and hives and fatigue, well, I had to end up working with my gut, and work through all the layers of the gut health. And, because that's the root of the immune system. And that's where I start with all my patients. I like comprehensive stool testing first visit. I want to know what
That's
is
my
happening.
favorite. I love it. Oh, you learned so much from that.
Some people tell me I do organic acids, and I'm like, no, the gut is where I learned to start. And so, working through all those layers of my own gut health, um, it's been okay. Then there's toxins, and then there's metals, and it actually took me all of these years to learn that I have Lyme disease.
Wow.
And so, and that's a whole nother long story, but some people with immune dysfunction will not test positive on the traditional tests. And so in my own case, I have chronically low immunoglobulins. I have impaired T cell function, which is your immune cells. I have a low CD57, which is your natural killer cells, another type of immune cell, and Lyme can suppress that. But I've had multiple tests through the years and never tested positive on a Western blot. So I just wasn't making the antibodies to test positive. Now there's some other types of testing that we can use. And somebody actually gave me a free test of a genetic PCR test. And I don't routinely use it on my patients because it costs $500. So it's a pretty pricey test. But that test told me that I had two kinds of Lyme and two kinds of Babesia, which is a co-infection. And they were pretty low levels. And then now I send tests off to Germany. There's a company there called Armin Labs, ARMIN, and they've been very useful. So they test T cells. So the Western blot test is testing your B cell antibody response. And if they aren't working, the T cells are more sensitive. So what Dr. Armin Schwarzbach told me is that their testing is 20 to 200 times more sensitive than the Western blot testing. And if you have an active infection, your T cells should be responding. So even if they don't work so well like mine, they still should be responding. So when I sent my testing into Armin, it also confirmed that I had Lyme and Babesia. And then fast forward to, I mean, the things that you uncover over time, even when it's on your own self, I actually have a lesion in my brain. And I have a friend that I made this year who's a chief of neuroradiology at one of the centers around here. And she thinks like a functional medicine doctor. So she's looking at patterns in the MRI that nobody else does. And she can see effects of toxins and infections. And so I asked her if she would go over my scans for me. And I had multiple MRI scans since 2003. And she showed me, I was noted this white matter lesion in 2003. And in every scan, it's gotten bigger and bigger. So now there's this very obvious lesion there. And I consulted with another UCSF neuroradiology friend, and, they both said they think that lesion in my brain is from Lyme. So it's taken me all of these many years of, learning how do you even diagnose Lyme properly, because for me, the traditional testing never showed up positive. So,
Wow.
Lyme wreaks havoc with the immune system. And, so it's been a journey of getting all of those various factors in balance. And, it is a journey, but, the good news is that, that my brain works, that I can learn,
Yeah.
that I can remember, that I can put things together. So, to come from somebody who couldn't use a computer and drive a car or understand what was being said to where I am now, it's just been a fantastic, journey of learning. And I learn every day still. I study every day, every night, trying to understand how do we put all this stuff together to help people. So now I can move my patients much more quickly than I could move myself.
Right, right. Isn't that always, you go through your own journey, and it's like, that seems like the longest thing, but you kind of have to work your way through it and experiment. And it's like, oh, I can help you way faster.
Yeah, I told that to somebody yesterday. We had just turned up all kinds of infections, bless her heart. And, and it was, first we turned up toxo, and then the testing came from Armin Labs, and there was Lyme and Babesia and Bartonella. And, this is somebody who's very healthy, a physician, and, has been into, the functional stuff. And unfortunately right now, because of her illness, she's a mess. And she's like, oh my God, how long is it going to take me to get well? I said, well, it's going to be a journey. I don't have a crystal ball, and I said, but, she said, but it took you 3 years to get well. I go, yes, but I was sick back then. I didn't know anything. So now you stand on my shoulders. I can help you to get better much faster than I could.
That's right. And your brain works so well now that you're able to have your practice, and you're writing a book, which you briefly mentioned earlier, but it's called Dementia Demystified. Can you talk about what's the short story of the book there? What's your goal with that?
Yeah, well, my first goal is just to get the message out more to the world that dementia is not a death sentence, and then have people understand these various factors that have to be tested and have to be addressed in order to work through it. So I'm trying to not be too OCD, which is hard for me. I like, details, but I'm trying to make it a practical how-to guide. With LIST, I spent weeks trying to, work on my lab chapter, and it's gonna, it lists everything I do. Where do you get it? What does it cost? If you have Kaiser, how can you get it? So I'm trying to, make it accessible for everybody to understand how to at least start working this up, how to understand what the problems are, because I know I have patients that freak out when I find things. They come back for the second visit and the third visit, and I warn them, look, I'm going to find things. That's what I do. I'm a detective. I find things, but knowledge is power. So when I find these things that are wrong, don't despair. These are my treatment targets. This is how I can help you to get better. So that's really what I want people to know is, first the hope, and then the layers, that they need to work through. Sorry, my kitty wants to come into the picture.
Yeah, that's really exciting. Do you have a launch date? Is it early 2019? No, not yet.
You know what? It's got to be finished, sometime this year. I'm really setting aside some time in the next 2 months to try to get the bulk of it finished, because it is. I know, people are suffering and they're dying and despairing, and so that really is my goal, is to get some tools out for people to know how to start going after this.
Well,
not enough doctors.
right.
Doctors are trying to learn, and they're doing the training, and they do the training, and they still don't really actually, after a weekend training, have the tools, to understand. Doctors are writing me, well, how do I test for mold? How do I test for Lyme? How do you treat the Lyme? So
right.
there's more information to get out to people.
Well, Kat, thank you so much for doing what you do, for writing your book. That's really exciting. Before that comes out, though, how can people find you? What's your website? What's your Facebook?
Yeah. Okay, great. The name of the book is Dementia Demystified, so that will link to my website. And Facebook is my name. It says Kat Toups MD Functional Medicine, Psychiatry, and Dementia. So if you put my name in there, there's one that's my personal site that I don't post much on, but on my work Facebook site, I really try to post a lot of interesting data and hopeful information. I try to stay away from the doom and gloom and say, okay, here's new stuff, right? We want to keep the hope part of it going for people to understand that all these things are within our control, that we can change them.
Oh, I love that. So powerful. And it's such an important message to get out there to people. So thank you so much for being on the podcast and for sharing it with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And thank you too for all that you do and getting the message out to all of the people that you're doing. It's really, really wonderful.